these completely divergent impulses, which I would think would have characterized his feelings about America in general, like obvious reason to negate a lot of the industry here, but obviously a fascination with it, an inspiration from its history, a kind of push and pull feeling. What is customary about the melodrama in American film is the way that it always evolved from popular forms. Obviously, it came from theater in the turn of the century. But the sources for many of the most famous melodramas that we associate with Douglas Sirk are these short stories, these journal stories that came out for ladies, and were, mediocre to say the most of them, and disposable. And they came out in profuse amounts through the war years and subsequently. And it took this sort of Brechtian curiosity about how to critique aspects of American culture to start with these sort of paltry pieces of popular literature and turn them into these films which at the time may not have been seen as much more than these stories themselves, but have come to be returned to over and again for their subtlety, the ways in which they sort of self-critique American society without a huge sort of intellectual approach that's made known, in grand strokes, or as many A-list films were trying to do at the time. And it's why people like Fassbinder found this form, the melodrama, almost more radical, applying it even to the German cinema that he accelerated in the 70s for critiquing his own culture, and choosing to do so when his contemporaries were doing much more direct, radical kinds of political cinema coming out of late 60s Marxist intellectual practice. Fassbinder was a product of that as well, but he opted for the popular form over the intellectual form as a means of critique. He rejected, in many ways, the overtly political, socialist styles cinema, whatever, Straboulet and the radical cinema, I guess, of Marxist-informed cinema of the late 60s. Although he was a product of that culture, he did not, that wasn't, although he understood it, he understood its terms. He participated in it in some ways, in Germany in Autumn, but he was not going to be a didactic filmmaker. He was going to use illusion and narrative and artifice as a way of getting to truth. He didn't believe, as Godard did, that, you just speak the truth and it comes out that way. The mediation was something that interested him, and felt that that's where the truth lay. It wasn't in that the terms of address were not that available as a stable, mechanism. He wanted to use illusion and emotion. It's the Brecht, it's the feeling versus thinking dilemma that I don't think he was ever going to give up one for the other entirely. I would say that's where it comes from, but obviously he felt, as a European, as an intellectual, he was never going to be able to be as naive and maybe honest and open and trusting as products of Hollywood cinema suggest. That was never going to be an option, and maybe somewhere inside him he wished it could be. People have a hard time understanding entirely Fassbinder's love of Sirk, particularly when he describes him with that tenderness that he does. How much he almost envied a love and a compassion for people that he saw in these films of Sirk's that he could only partially feel himself. he obviously identified, they shared a lot of intellectual sort of history and positioning, you know, but he still saw a greater generosity toward humankind, I think, in Cirque. And many people would disagree and say, what do you mean? Cirque has a coldness. Cirque is a critiquer of American culture, you know, as you are a critiquer, Fassbinder, of German culture, without indulging in the sentiment or in what we usually think of in American film as love or tenderness is usually in a sentimental mode. And that really isn't Cirque. You know, Imitation of Life maybe is the one tearjerker of Douglas Sirk. But I don't think people really think of him as that kind of a director. So there's something else that Fassbinder saw, and I don't really know exactly what it was, except that I think he saw, maybe this is where I feel similarly, a powerful political potential in the melodrama form when it's executed with that kind of intelligence and visual mastery, that he saw it as, and maybe there is tenderness in this, but a way of looking at the powerless. You know, if you're going to distinguish melodrama from other genres, it's really about the powerless. And the other American classic film genres are about male-dominated realms, which are about power and freedom and, you know, determining your own frontier or whatever. And these are about people trapped in houses and social morality. And I think he saw that that's where we all intersect as subjects in a society, a corrupt society, under the auspices of moral, domestic culture. And that I think he saw the melodrama explored that beautifully as something of a critical potential, but also one that's about, obviously, compassion, because it's about the weak. And they're not heroic. They don't overcome their odds at the end. They buckle under the pressures of their cultures. So that unites us with other victims, you know. I mean, I just think, I just love how he chose the most bourgeois form of all to tell his stories, to tell his political, historical, revisioning of German society, every aspect of it, every economic, the spectrum of it, and the first German filmmaker to talk about, you know, Nazi history, with that kind of strength and that kind of intelligence and complexity, that quickly. It's phenomenal, really. It's just an amazing thing, and it's also amazing that the system in the 70s allowed for his freedom of expression, the way in America there was a break in the 70s where more authentic voices could make films. To me, it's all about timing for him. That I worry that the more he gets into the 80s, as the logical time he would have made it here, would be the hardest time for him to have freedom to make his own film. Even if it just failed and just flopped, I still wonder about the process, the freedom to do it his own way and without, interference. That would be my question, because you know what it was like by the late 70s. The restraints were after Heaven's Gate, after the success of blockbuster films and platform releases like Jaws, and then the failure of the director-driven auteur catastrophe of Heaven's Gate. I think the openness would have been really hard. So I think it would be less about him than the industry at the moment that he would have been here, if we could have all chosen a different timetable. I'd love him to have been able to come here in the mid-70s or early 70s when there was just so much openness. And it's funny, there weren't a lot of European directors being embraced or brought into that. There really was a kind of club that seemed to generate from a specific generation of filmmakers who had relationships amongst themselves that were not, for once, really for the first time in several decades, that were not really interacting with Europe, or drawing the same. Obviously, they were in their schooling and in '60s New Wave cinema, but I don't think by the time they were actually in practice, there was that same desire to reach out to Europe, really in a way that, as we said earlier, has characterized Hollywood from its inception. Maybe the '70s are the first time what we might call real American filmmaking emerged without a European influence. So maybe even in the mid-'70s, it would have been a time that would have been harder for Fassbinder. It was just an amazing time that it was going on at the same time. I mean, new German cinema, even beyond Fassbinder, was amazing, diverse, and active, really active at that time. It was really, just thank God Fassbinder was there at that moment, to produce what he did. I don't know if I can even apply, direct, a direct application of Fassbinder to any one particular film of mine, although safe in its setting itself in a familiar genre, and then setting up all of these barriers to the usual rewards we expect from that genre. That there's things that were going to be in the way of our access to this character, et cetera. And stylization, starting with real speech and distilling it down into a more stylized, at times abstract, kind of, media form of expression, and visually as well. I guess in that way, yeah, it is. It's like the kind of, Chinese roulette, the kind of freezing over of social interaction kind of film. But to me, he represents more of a general spirit, I think, of interrogative responses to classic form that inspires me, because I don't feel like I'm inventing anything when I make films. I feel like I'm only interpreting what exists around me and responding to it and molding it in one way or another. But it's true, people brought up Ali Field's The Soul because of the racial element that Fassbinder introduced in his adaptation of All That Heaven Allows. And really, the mode or the way that film functions is not with the kind of much more challenging kind of narrative, repositionings that Fassbinder set up in his films. Although Ali is, in many ways, one of the most directly emotive, engrossing and involving of his movies, where you feel a tenderness that might be as close to Cirque, as in any of his films. Maybe Fox and His Friends as well. But yeah, no, I really was I was really trying to learn from the Circean model and be a very obedient subject to it, and really humble myself and learn everything, every aspect of the visual language and the narrative language in it. Fassbinder was creating his own visual language that kept evolving and deepening and from film to film. But I think you can see, aspects of it as a continuum across his body of work, although the films are so different as well. Some much more within a kind of naturalistic setting, and others really breaking out of that. Yeah, I think he was doing his own language.